Well, welcome everybody. I am Nate Anderson. I'm an Army veteran and the Executive Director at Concerned Veterans for America. I just want to welcome you and thank you for joining our event, Reforming America's Foreign Policy, a bipartisan discussion on ending endless wars. And if you have not yet heard of Concerned Veterans for America, I do want to encourage you to check us out. Our website is cv4a.org. We're also on Twitter at Concerned Vets and Facebook at Concerned Vets for America. And as the name suggests, and you might guess, we're here to talk about our 20 years of war in the Middle East, the legal problems that those wars present, and really the solutions that could place the United States in a position to better protect itself and its interests, as well as remaining prosperous here at home. It's a very important and pivotal time, not just for the president, but as well as the Congress. And earlier this month, just as an example, we saw the 18-year anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. We're rapidly approaching the 20-year anniversary of our war in Afghanistan, which is unprecedented. And we are just 1 month from the May 1st deadline for US troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. As per the agreement the US negotiated in Doha last February. And we at Concerned Veterans for America truly believe the right thing for our nation, as well as our military community, is to bring our service members home and turn the page away from our policy of endless war. And the coalition that has been fighting for that has made tremendous progress in recent years. And I'm very pleased to be joined by a few of those individuals this evening. So let me introduce our guests. Starting with Representative Peter Meijer. Congressman Meijer is a proud fourth-generation West Michigander, born and raised in Grand Rapids. After graduating high school, he enlisted in the Army Reserves and deployed to Iraq as a non-commissioned officer. After returning from Iraq in 2011 and finishing his studies at Columbia University, Representative Meijer joined Team Rubicon and led humanitarian efforts in South Sudan dealing with a refugee crisis. He also led operations following natural disasters in New York, Oklahoma, and the Philippines. Representative Meijer later accepted a job with a conflict analysis NGO in Afghanistan. And following that time in Afghanistan, he pursued his MBA at New York University, then returned to Michigan to work in urban redevelopment and in real estate. Representative, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
My next guest is Ms. Heather Brandon-Smith. Heather Brandon-Smith is Legislative Director for Militarism and Human Rights at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Heather leads FCNL's work to repeal outdated war authorizations, promote respect for human rights and international law, and reduce US armed interventions around the world. Heather is an adjunct professor of law at the Georgetown University Law Center, and her writing has appeared in The Hill, Lawfare, Just Security, and Intercross. She holds an LLM from Georgetown University Law Center and a BA in Politics and International Relations, an LLB and an LLM from the University of South Wales in Sydney, Australia. Welcome, Heather Brandon-Smith. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Nate. It's great to be here.
And Dr. Will Ruger. Dr. Ruger serves as Vice President for Research and Policy at the Charles Koch Institute and as Vice President of Foreign Policy at Stand Together. He was previously an associate professor at the Department of Political Science at Texas State University and an adjunct assistant professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin. Ruger is a veteran of the war in Afghanistan, and he serves as an intelligence officer in the United States Navy Reserves. And most recently, Dr. Ruger was nominated for U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan under President Donald J. Trump. Dr. Ruger, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And we are expecting one additional guest. That's Representative Khanna. And I will give an intro for him, but he should be joining us here in about 5 minutes or so. So I'll do an intro for Representative Khanna. Representative Ro Khanna represents California's 17th congressional district, located in the heart of Silicon Valley, and is serving his third term. He sits on the House committees on Agriculture, Armed Services, and Oversight Reform, where he chairs an environmental subcommittee. Representative Khanna was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, during America's bicentennial to a middle-class family. Both of his parents immigrated to the United States in the 1970s from India in search of opportunity and a better life for their children. Prior to serving in Congress, Representative Khanna taught economics at Stanford University, law at Santa Clara University, and American jurisprudence at San Francisco State University. Representative Khanna also served under Barack Obama as Deputy Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Commerce, and we look forward to having him on with us. Before I get to my first question, I do want to invite our viewers, if you have questions, please drop them in whatever platform you're viewing, whether that's Zoom or on Facebook. Our staff is going to be selecting some of those questions, and we look forward to getting to some of those later on in the program. So let's get down to it. The first question is for Dr. Ruger, and the question is around grand strategy. I think it's smart to start there before we get into what we do or do not do in U.S. foreign policy. So, Dr. Ruger, your work of late has really centered around the idea of reframing American grand strategy in the world. I think it's a good place to start. If the United States took a new approach with our grand strategy, what might that look like?
Thanks, Nate. I think if you look at the last 20 to 30 years, it's taught us that our primacist foreign policy just hasn't been working to make America safer or to improve the conditions of our prosperity, whether it was things like the Bush-Cheney's war in Iraq or Obama's war in Libya. Our bipartisan foreign policy has brought us mistake after mistake and has not brought us successes. But I think fortunately there's a new emerging consensus that we need a new approach, and there's now a pretty robust transpartisan coalition that wants to help define what that would look like. And so it's exciting, just to start off with, Nate, it's exciting just to be here tonight to see people of different parties and perspectives, philosophic, foundations just come together and talk about how we can help end our endless wars. But as you said, it's bigger than just the ending endless wars, right? Ending these forever wars will advance our national interests, and that's important and something that the Stand Together community focuses on, Afghanistan foremost among them. But we really do need something that's more than that, right? We need a shift in our grand strategy and how America engages in the world, particularly in the military realm, from the aggressive militarized primacy of the past to one characterized, I think, by realism and restraint, right? Realism about the nature of the world and restraint in how we use force abroad. And what realism and restraint asks us to do is to be clear-headed about the constraints of the international system, about the things that, like the balance of power, about geography, right? The stopping power of water, the difficulties of projecting power across large geographic distances, the importance of nationalism and how that could constrain your ability to impose results that you would like to see in foreign countries. Not to mention the fact that an understanding that the adversary or the enemy or the other side gets a vote, right? Those are all important constraints to consider. And realism and restraint counsels a focus on securing our vital interests and avoiding idealistic crusades. And again, it's not that realism and restraint doesn't have a similarity with our past. It does, in the sense that it, like during containment or like during the era of Washington's great rule of the 19th century and early 20th century, realism and restraint takes power seriously. It understands and appreciates the need for a strong national defense. But what it recognizes is that good intentions aren't enough, and our foreign policy choices can harm Americans and those even we're ostensibly trying to help abroad. And so it says, look, we got to be careful about what we do and how we use American military power, that we don't spend, kind of precious blood and treasure abroad without a clear connection to our national interests and a strategy and set of tactics to achieve those things. And it also means that we need to prioritize among different goals that we have, right? Using resources like our military and our finances carefully to their most pressing needs. And that means understanding that we have domestic priorities that matter, and we have other foreign policy priorities than oftentimes the ones we're pursuing. So our wars in the Middle East have allowed us, to be fixated, to have our energies taken by that, rather than say, preparing for this pandemic or the next, or dealing with our big debt and deficits that Admiral Mullen talked about as our gravest national security threat, or thinking more about how to deal with the rise of China. So realism and restraint wants to prioritize, whether domestically or in terms of foreign policy choices. And it also means that we have to think about our role in the world differently. How can we find positive engagement through diplomacy, through things like trade, and also how we can smartly use alliances and partnerships in ways that understand that those are means to an end, not ends in themselves or something sacred or above criticism. And so I guess what I would say is we need a new approach. Realism and restraint is, I think, a time-tested way to meet our interests in the world, and something that can rally people across the spectrum, like the people represented on this panel. And I think that that's going to be a better way for America to engage in the world, because it's not sticking your head in the sand. It's about doing things abroad smarter and understanding the costs and consequences of your behavior.
Dr. Ruger, thank you. Thank you for that answer. I want to welcome officially Representative Khanna to the conversation. Thank you, Representative, for being here. We just got started. You have not missed much. Why don't I go to Representative Meijer for the next question, and then to you after that, Representative Khanna. So the next question, Representative Meijer, in addition to your service in Iraq, you also worked in Afghanistan for the Conflict Management NGO, and since then you've spoken out about America's endless wars, the kind of the status quo foreign policy that we've been pursuing, and I'm curious how your experiences have shaped your views.
Well, thank you, Nate. But before I answer that, I just want to touch on what Dr. Ruger said. I mean, just the sense that we have this linearity of engagement between, well, we have a conflict, do we send in some cruise missiles or a special forces team, all the way up to an occupation, misses that there are multiple axes upon which we can engage with the world. And we forget the soft power, we forget our diplomatic efforts, we forget, frankly, our ability on the intelligence side to understand better before it becomes a war in the first place. And that was something I saw firsthand in Afghanistan. As you mentioned, I spent twice as much time in Afghanistan as a non-combatant as I did in Iraq as a combatant. And I'll be honest, when I went to Iraq in 2010, I was full of vim and vigor and hope and optimism that, we could have a positive impression. I left quite despondent about our prospects of what our military could actually accomplish. Driving around in, $1 million up armored vehicles that could be destroyed by $150 shape charge that the Iranians made. I didn't like being on that end, on the wrong end of a cost benefit analysis. And frankly, that's how many of our conflicts have skewed, where we see all of our technology, all of our investments really becoming more of a burden than a benefit, a liability, not an asset. So when it came to my experiences in Afghanistan, that's when I really appreciated the fact that what I saw in Iraq that was dysfunctional, that was doomed to failure, that was not unique to that one conflict. This has been a trademark of our post 9/11 conflicts, because we overpromise to ourselves what we're willing to commit, and then inherently ask more of the men and women in our military than they can actually reasonably deliver. And so when I think of political realism, I think of actually aligning what we're willing to invest, and saying, is that sufficient to get the return that is required? And the old saying in Afghanistan is, the US, we might have the watches, but the Taliban have the time. It's going to be rare that we're involved in a foreign country where American forces or the American people are more passionate about the outcome, are willing to invest more, are willing to put more blood and treasure towards an outcome, than the folks who live there. So if we're never going to achieve, what politicians promise us is going to be the outcome, then we need to recalibrate and we need to step back.
Just a quick follow-up to that. As somebody who is a veteran and now somebody who represents veterans who served over the past 2 decades, what effects from your perspective does this perpetual state of war have on our all-volunteer military force and their families?
I think it has two different impacts. On the one hand, you can get this this kind of warrior class, right, where you can kind of be guaranteed you'll have the opportunity to go and deploy and serve in some combat environment in one way, shape, or form, and that just becomes part of the cycle. The benefit of that is that you, as a member of the military, can have that experience. The downside is you look at a lot of the general officers who've seen their path to promotion be through engaging in these conflicts. And now those are the very same folks who are essentially supposed to be a neutral advisor, but oftentimes their bias is towards trying to complete the unfulfilled and frankly, the unfulfillable mission that they started. So I think that on the one hand is a large problem, but then the broader sense is the civil military divide that's been created through the all volunteer force means that the negative consequences, the pain, the loss is being felt by a very insular community. And though there may be good geographic spread, at the end of the day, a lot of Americans may know depending on where you grew up, depending on what social circles you're in, you may not know anybody in the military. I had a lot of friends for whom I was the only person they knew who had served in the military, who were deployed overseas. And that may be radically different in another community, but just that sense that when we're fighting overseas, it's not the country fighting. It is a smaller and smaller subset of our population that's actually bearing that burden. And it's a lot easier to forget the costs of that conflict when it's not something that you're seeing and you're feeling within the people that you're engaging with.
I think you're spot on, Representative. Thank you. Thank you for that. Representative Khanna, again, thank you for joining. During your time in Congress, you've been witnessed and you've witnessed giving voice to the American public's growing opposition, unease, if you will, to the war in Afghanistan. And as a member of Congress, when the Afghanistan papers were revealed in the Washington Post, can you tell us how you felt about this revelation that top civilian and military leaders had been lying to the American people about this war for nearly 2 decades?
Well, Nate, thank you. And let me just say thank you to Representative Meijer for his service to our country and for his very thoughtful perspective. It matters a lot to have people who have served and then are articulating caution in terms of these interventions. And Dr. Ruger, great to see you again. I mean, I felt, I can't say I was surprised because anyone who has looked at basic history going back to the British or the Soviets or anyone who has any familiarity with the subcontinent would tell you that those are unwinnable wars. I mean, the aspiration that the United States sitting miles away was going to be able to do something that the Soviets and the British failed to do. When we're not a colonial power and we have no interest in being a colonial power. I mean, we're not like the British colonial empire where they literally trained people to be all over the world. I think that was obvious to people. I mean, I supported the initial strikes when we were hit. I said, yes, we should strike Afghanistan, take out Al Qaeda. I think the entire country rallied around that. But somehow that morphed into this sense that we were going to try to take out the Taliban and install a new regime. And it was just utterly naive. And people died as a result of that. And American tax dollars were wasted as a result of that, and trillions of dollars of debt. And there ought to be an accountability. I mean, I've called on the Armed Services Committee for a hearing on there should be a investigative hearing on those Afghan papers and why people blatantly lied and some sense of accountability. And what's amazing to me is the same people who were responsible of getting us in this mess are now making the decisions of recommending when we should get out to the president. I mean, it's only in the last 20 years where you fail up in foreign policy. We need just a fresh pair of eyes on what our policy should be. One that's very clear that we need to protect the country and our national security, but not go chasing these interventions that have left us less secure.
Thank you, Representative. Indeed, fresh eyes are helpful often. My next question is for Ms. Brandon Smith. As the legislative director for militarism and humanitarian rights at FCNL, you're obviously very familiar with grassroots advocacy efforts, and so my question is, what do you think that the political costs could be to the Biden administration if it rejects this May 1st Afghanistan withdrawal deadline under the Doha Agreement?
Is a really good question. And, as has already been alluded to, the American public is sick of these wars. Is really sick of the Afghanistan war, which is the longest in US history. It's longer than World War II, World War I, and the Civil War combined. And even you could throw in some other smaller wars there. So, I think that if the Biden administration rejected this May 1st deadline, that would certainly be going against what the public generally wants. So it is certainly a risky move. Will say I have been heartened to see the administration talking about other steps that they are making to affect responsible withdrawal. We saw a few days ago, Secretary of State Blinken talking about the need to, come up with a comprehensive ceasefire, bringing regional actors to the table, other nations that have an interest and influence in Afghanistan. These are really critical, partners that we need to work with to try and bring some sort of stability to Afghanistan. So it's good to see this sort of multi-pronged effort that's being undertaken. We need the full military withdrawal. We also need to resist this desire to leave behind a counterterrorism force, which is something else that is very concerning. We saw earlier this week that, CIA-backed forces in Afghanistan conducted an operation in which 17 civilians were killed. This is the type of operation that could be ongoing even after US troops, withdraw from the country. So, that's another aspect of this that, really needs to be rejected. And again, really goes against what the American public wants.
Thank you. I want to open that question up to the rest of the panel briefly and just pause here. What do we think that the Biden administration should expect if it does blow through this May 1st Doha Agreement deadline?
I'm happy to kind of jump on that. I mean, I serve on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and I've been pleasantly surprised by some of the dialogue among some of the actors in the administration, in our Department of Defense, and in the intelligence community more broadly, about how they're viewing the May 1st deadline and the conflict more broadly. To Heather's point, I don't think there's a domestic appetite, and I frankly think that's permeated into the political system. Now, whether that exists at the Pentagon and at the Joint Chiefs level, to me, is a very different question. I feel like every time we start to come up on a withdrawal date deadline, or there's talk about that, there'll be a news article that says, oh, somebody is concerned that if we leave, Kabul is going to fall to the Taliban tomorrow. And I personally think some of that is nonsense, or it's very calibrated to achieve and give ammunition to the same folks who just want to perpetuate what we're going through right now. I do think we'll probably see a renegotiation, under the May 1st, under the Doha Agreement terms with the May 1st withdrawal date. There were plenty of provisions where we could say credibly that the Taliban did not live up to their end of the bargain. But more so than that, I've been pleasantly surprised by the letter that Secretary of State Blinken wrote to Ashraf Ghani, essentially saying, don't take us for granted. This is not going to be something we'll be in for a very long time. If May 1st, which doesn't look like it'll be hit, if that isn't that date, there's a chance the Taliban kind of scream and pout. or there's a chance that, this is the prelude to some type of negotiated power sharing agreement, which is, I think, the only way we achieve peace in Afghanistan. And the more the U.S. steps back, but is mindful of who steps forward, the more we may be able to achieve a positive one. So I think there's good expectation management all around. Again, I'll revisit my opinion on that in 6 months, but I at least doesn't seem to be a reversion or a snapback to the mean. Now, just how close we get towards where we should be going is an open question that remains to be seen.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Khanna, I want to give you a chance also. You have a very unique perspective on Capitol Hill, and I'm curious what you think about what the Biden administration might expect here if they do go past the deadline. It's no easy choice, as they've said. And I think that there's a variety of different outcomes we could see here. What are your thoughts?
Well, I first agree with what Heather said, is that there are civilian casualties going on now. And I think that's an important point, because when people talk about withdrawal, they say, well, what about the women and the children and the killings? And they don't factor in that there are a lot of civilian killings going on because of the war. And the idea that somehow that will be aggravated if we leave, I just don't think are borne out by the facts, which is why you have a lot of women's groups and others in these countries saying that peace is better than continued conflict. I think there's no doubt in my mind that President Biden needs to get out of Afghanistan. Whether it happens on May 1st or whether it happens by the end of the year, I don't think is going to pay a political price personally. But if it looks like that he's not committed to leaving, and if it goes much beyond the end of the year, the next 6 months, as Representative Meijer said, then I think there's going to be a major political backlash. I mean, I think people will give him, they usually give a new president a chance. I think they'll give him and Secretary Blinken till the end of the year to figure out how to get out. My view is I don't think there's a very complicated situation. If we ever have actionable threats to the United States, we can always go in again. I mean, if it looks like that there really was something that could hurt Americans in the homeland. So I think that has been demonstrated, or a capacity to do that. And that means that we should be able to withdraw. And I would expect that they do it by the end of the year. If they don't, I think the longer they wait, the more blowback there's going to start to have from Congress, I think, on a bipartisan basis.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative. Dr. Ruger, I want to ask you a slightly different question about going back to what you first opened with around grand strategy. And I think you have an interesting perspective as former ambassador nominee to Afghanistan, as well as an Afghanistan veteran yourself. What do you see as the strategic case for a full U.S. withdrawal?
Well, I think the strategic case is that we've largely accomplished what we set out to do after 9/11. And I think, like the other panelists, there was we talked about there being a need for the United States to do something after 9/11. I think we needed to do three things. We needed to punish the Taliban for its state support for Al-Qaeda. I think we needed to attrit and decimate Al-Qaeda as an effective organization with an intent and capability to harm the United States, as proven by 9/11. And I think we needed to kill or capture Osama bin Laden. And we largely accomplished all three of those. And what happened, unfortunately, is that we weighed down this effort by adding all kinds of nice to haves in terms of our war aims. And unfortunately, a lot of those nice to haves came at great cost, and we haven't achieved them. In fact, they're very unlikely to be achievable. We simply aren't going to be able to effectively change a country like Afghanistan, particularly given all of the vested interests and the stickiness of culture, and the fact that the United States has very limited capabilities to do so, even when we had tens of thousands of troops there, over 100,000 coalition forces there. Our ability to simply remake Afghanistan in a way that we would like is simply just not a reality. And it's not a reality if we spend generations there. And I think the United States needs to think about what is necessary versus what might be nice to have. And then when it comes to the nice to have, do cost benefit analysis. And there, I think it's very clear that coming home is the best solution for the United States. We've done what we needed to do, and we need to focus on other things. That's a better use of our resources. I would say one thing that is important about Afghanistan is, again, back to the issue of transnational terrorism, right? We need to make sure that there aren't groups that have, again, and not just an intent, but a capability to harm the United States. But we need to look at those globally. We need to be paying attention to anywhere someone or some group might be plotting something like 9/11. Fortunately, we have other different types of capabilities other than a large footprint military force to do so. And we certainly don't need to remake a country to make sure that we're staying on top of using intelligence, using partners and allies, using policing, right? Using over the horizon capability, special operations forces to make sure that we keep America safe. And I think all of the people on this panel want us to be safe, but we don't want to do the kind of things that actually, rebound against us, or simply are wastes of blood and treasure without a real sustainable path forward to meeting those kind of nice goals.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to transition here in a moment and talk a little bit about Congress's role in foreign policy, our authorizations for use of military force and war powers generally. Before we do that, I do want to pause and welcome anybody who has joined us a little bit late. I'm Nate Anderson, Executive Director of Concerned Vets for America, and I'm privileged to be joined by Representative Khanna of California, Representative Peter Meijer of Michigan, as well as Ms. Heather Brandon Smith of FCNL, and Dr. Will Ruger of Stand Together. And if you have any questions, I encourage you to drop those in the chat of whatever platform you're joining us on, whether that's Facebook or here in Zoom. We encourage your questions, and our staff's going to be looking through some of those and pulling them to ask a couple of them here a little bit later in the program. My next question is for Representatives Khanna and Meijer. You've both helped champion the efforts in the House to support repeal of the outdated authorizations for use of military force, AUMFs, and to protect the US from getting into wars that Congress hasn't authorized. And so as two members of Congress, known for your willingness to work with partners across the political spectrum in pursuit of the shared vision, how do you view the political prospects for progress on these efforts in this session of Congress? Representative Khanna, I'll go to you first.
Well, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that you have an administration and a Congress that recognizes that those authorizations are overbroad. I mean, I got a call from the administration saying, why did you criticize us over the Syria strikes? Aren't you going to give the president 100 days? I said, I didn't expect him to be bombing in the first 100 days. I wanted to give him 100 days, but you saw after that pushback, even from Democrats, saying that there has to be authorization to undertake these efforts. And I guess it's a hard thing to get authorization for Congress. The founders intended it to be hard, but if there's a real threat to the United States, I don't think it would be hard. I think overwhelmingly you would have gotten the authorization, and did, when it came to 9/11, and after that, President Bush basically got the authorization of Congress to go and do whatever he wanted, and if anything, it was overbroad. And I think in 2014, when ISIS was a threat, Obama would have probably gotten the authorization for that. So I guess there is not a historical precedent, in my view, where we've really been threatened, where the president comes to Congress, hasn't gotten that authorization, and we think, wow, wouldn't it have really been good if Congress had acted? There are precedents where President Obama didn't get an authorization to go into Syria, and I think that was a smart thing, that we didn't get embroiled into those wars. But what I often ask people is, give me the counterfactual, give me the situation where a president of the United States came to Congress, our national security was threatened, and Congress failed to act. I just don't think that situation exists. So the challenge is often, well, what should the authorization be? And I think if we have a sunsetting provision that has limited authorization for this Congress on things we can agree on, that is the key, and I work with anyone on how we can get that.
Representative Meijer.
I definitely share Rose's optimism on that front. I think this is an interesting issue that goes, it doesn't necessarily fit, and as the Stand Together Coalition shows, it doesn't fit along kind of traditional ideological or partisan lines. I was disappointed. We recently had a House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing. We're marking up a repeal of the 2002 AUMF, and there's, I think, still a lot of folks who don't really understand what has been authorized on some of these authorizations to use of military force. I'm part of a bipartisan piece of legislation to try to repeal the 2002, the 1991, and the 1957 AUMFs. So that's respectively the Iraq War that started in 2003, the Gulf War in 1991, and then an Eisenhower era authorization to repel communist influence in Lebanon and the Levant. Now, all of those wars have ended. I don't think anyone can disagree that we're no longer fighting against the Iraqi government and Saddam Hussein's regime. Changing them wouldn't have actually impacted anything that's occurred in the past 8 years when it comes to the 02, or the past 20 years when it comes to the 91, or the past 50, almost 60, over 60 years when it comes to the 57. And yet there's still hesitation that, to Rose's point on the counterfactual, there's this hesitation on, well, what happens if X occurs? What happens if Y occurs? And so despite trying to find the worst case scenario to try to make the argument for why we need to keep these outdated AUMFs, let alone revisiting the 2001, folks were saying, well, we wouldn't have been able to do X. It's like, no, we didn't use the 2002 authorization for that. So I think it's a hard issue for some to wrap their head around, and they realize that there's safety in the status quo. If you change something, you have to take ownership of it. If you leave it as it is, well, that was somebody else's problem, right? So we have the accountability issue first and foremost. But I do think that there's room to be reevaluating, but it requires Congress to actively try to take back that responsibility. I think there's room for AUMF reform so that we have a more modular system that's bounded by geography, that's bounded by, who the target is, and that's most importantly, has a sunset provision so that, if there's a limited engagement that may be necessary, not only is Congress authorizing it, but they're also making sure that's not a blank check. They're going to make it targeted, they're going to make it specific, and they're going to make sure that there's a revision period. Because in what I've been saying, at least in the conversations around AUMF repeal, even for things we're not using, trying to introduce those kind of more zany scenarios. And well, what do we do if this happens? Setting aside Article 2 self-defense powers, setting aside, Title 50 presidential findings, and all of the other, mechanisms at the president's disposal. The simple answer is you have Congress write a new AUMF, right? And yet that just seems like such an impossible hurdle because so many folks have gotten used to the legislative and political safety of just doing nothing. So I'm hopeful that there's the energy to change it, but it's going to take some strong bipartisan work to say that the status quo is not working. The status quo is putting our country at greater risk, and it's not improving our national security at the end of the day.
I want to pause on this issue because I think it's pretty important. And I'm going to go back to you, Representative Khanna. Since 9/11, there have been two authorizations for use of military force, the 2001-2002 authorizations. And can you walk our audience through the issues with the open-endedness, the vagueness in that language, and how it's contributed to some of the conflicts that we still find ourselves engaged in without accountability?
Well, the broad authorization in Afghanistan, obviously by definition, had no end date. So we're using that still to be 20 years later in a Congress that is not the one that authorized it. Probably very few people. I don't know how many members of Congress are still there who authorized it, and we're still using it. And then the authorization to go into Iraq was so broadly written that people have used it to strike anything in Iraq, even if it's not Iraqis. They've used it to twist the definitions and is striking things out of Iraq if it looks like that it was related in some way to a terrorist threat that was connected to Iraq. So they've been stretched in terms of the geography. They've been stretched in terms of the enemy. They've been stretched in terms of time. But again, the reason, let's just be very clear about this. The reason that the president and the executive branch have been forced to use twisted authorizations is they obviously think that they can't just come to Congress and get a new authorization. If they thought it was simple to come to Congress, they won't need lawyers looking for twisted definitions. Well, what does that suggest? That suggests that there's some political hesitancy in Congress. There wouldn't, again, to my previous point, there would be no political hesitancy when I still remember how patriotic I thought it was after 9/11. You had the entire Congress outside the steps of the Congress singing "God Bless America," and you would have almost no one oppose that. In fact, I thought Barbara Lee was courageous to point out that there was probably too broad an authorization. But my point is that the fact that the president isn't willing to come to Congress for new authorization suggests that it's not a clean-cut case, and that's why they ought to be repealed, because I believe that the president should have to come to Congress for an authorization of force. And I don't think you have a situation in our country where you're not going to have congressional action when our national security is really at risk.
Just continuing this conversation around the role that Congress plays, I want to go to Ms. Brennan Smith, and as a longtime expert on Congress's legal war-making authorities, I want to ask you, how does the War Powers Resolution of 1973 impact the balance between Congress and the president's war-making powers?
That's a really great question. I think that there's a lot of misapprehension of what the War Powers Resolution actually does. You hear a lot of times there's talk of the president has this power under the War Powers Resolution, or Congress has this power under the War Powers Resolution. The power comes from the Constitution. Congress is the body that has the authority to declare war, to make a determination of whether the US goes to war, against whom, where, for how long. Congress is perfectly within its right to authorize limited uses of force. It's been doing so since the 1700s. And then you have a limited defensive power in Article 2 of the Constitution that the president has as commander-in-chief to defend the nation against a sudden attack. The War Powers Resolution sort of seeks to provide a framework around that division of war powers. So, it provides that the president can only use force, if there is a declaration of war or some other sort of statutory authorization. These days, it's usually an AUMF, an authorization for the use of military force, or, a national emergency that happens as a result of an attack upon the US or armed forces. And that's really trying to sort of capture the understanding of the president's commander-in-chief authority to use force in this sort of limited, defensive circumstance. And then you have the president can only use force for 60 days before they need to go to Congress and actually obtain an authorization or a declaration of war. So, there is no power granted to the president under the War Powers Resolution. Any action that the president takes using military force needs to already come under the president's Article 2 authority that the Constitution, gives to the president. And we've seen the interpretation of that power in the executive branch, regardless of which party is the president comes from. We've seen that really grow over the years to get to a point where you kind of wonder, what is the limiting principle here? And that's a real problem. And that's why, reform of, war powers and rebalancing that division of war powers is really critical at the moment.
What specific changes to that War Powers Resolution should policymakers consider in the future?
So one really big issue is this term hostilities that is in the War Powers Resolution. So, it talks about how the president is required to consult with Congress, when they're looking to introduce the US into hostilities, or when there's, a sort of an imminence of the US forces being involved in hostilities. We don't have a definition of that term in the War Powers Resolution. And the sort of a really clear example of where it was, really kind of misused and taken in a sort of dangerous direction was in Libya. We saw the Obama administration go in there and claim that because, we didn't have, it wasn't a troops on the ground, a boots on the ground, I should say, mission, we were conducting airstrikes and drone strikes, that didn't constitute hostilities. And so, the administration claimed they weren't required to obtain an AUMF from Congress. I don't think that's what the founders intended when they divided the war powers between Congress and the executive branch. And so defining hostilities to include those sorts of operations that, are clearly, sort of acts of war, that sort of use of military force would be a really big improvement. I also think that it probably would be good to decrease that 60-day amount of time where the president can use force without Congress to, perhaps 20 days. There's a lot of harm and a lot that can be done in 60 days, especially with the advanced weapons that exist today. So those are two changes that I think are due.
Thank you for the insight. I want to go to Dr. Ruger. Some members of Congress, some people, within the status quo, blob foreign policy, if you will, have said that efforts to repeal the current authorizations are too hasty. They have to involve more deliberate consultation with our allies or through deliberation within the national security apparatus. What's your view on that argument?
I think the United States should have the foreign policy and adhere to its constitutional, regime, regardless of what people outside of the country think. Going to what Heather and others have said, right? We have a constitution that dictates the ways in which we make decisions in this country in order to satisfy the best interests of our constituents, right? Representative Meijer, Representative Khanna represent their districts, and they're given a purview to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States for the purposes of the United States. So, sure, when it comes to how we engage in international politics, it's important to talk to allies and partners, and it's important to actually talk to adversaries as well. That's what diplomacy is about. But the fact is that when it comes to whether, we should go to war, that should be Congress's power. And the only power I see in the Constitution for the president to act unilaterally is to repel invasion, something like that, right? It's when there isn't time to go to Congress in order to make sure that our country isn't invaded or our capital isn't, taken over and burned, right? Those are the kinds of things that the Constitution was designed to give the president a kind of an energy, right? But when it came to other things, right, the Constitution purposely, the Madisonian vision of the Constitution was, look, we need to slow down and make sure we have the wisdom of the many, because it's the many that will pay the costs of war. And so we have the largest body, our representative body in Congress, that's going to take time and say, should we be fighting another forever war in Syria? Should we be going and engaging in a regime change in a place like Libya? Should we be, engaging in a conflict, where, whatever future ones would hold, that aren't related to repelling an invasion, but are related to how we use force when these are wars of choice. And I think that most wars in history, in American history, have been wars of choice in which we had the ability to say no or say yes. It would have been more wise or less, but Congress played a role. And the other thing too is just from the perspective of a kind of pragmatism, presidents who get the majority, right, of Americans behind them by going to Congress and having them play their proper role, I think will have an easier time making war and knowing that their country and their representatives are behind them to give them the resources required to prosecute that war effectively, rather than having something like Libya where there's no buy-in by a vote at all, right? Where the American public isn't educated through the process of having to listen to Congress deliberate. Instead, you have you have executive wars, right? Presidential wars, and then they rise and fall based on how they go in the short run, and the tides of public opinion perhaps will affect that, as opposed to having that long support and that deep support that you get from going to Congress and making your case. So I think it's just really important that Congress play this role, because I think we do believe in this country that we should have the wisdom of the many. And again, I'm not talking about how we have a plebiscite in the country where we have a vote on wars, but through our representative channels and the role that they play in essentially adjudicating and serving as a check on kind of public enthusiasm, but also a check on a president who would engage using plenary powers and being a vote of one. And that vote of one will be great if it's a philosopher king who understands the world maybe as well as Representative Meijer and Representative Khanna might. But most of the time we're not blessed with that, and we have to build our institutions around the possibility that we might get a president that isn't a philosopher king and might be rash or make bad decisions or not understand the world around him, because the world is complicated.
Thank you for that. I want to bring things full circle here. And I've got one more question, and then we're going to take just a couple of audience questions. And for our audience, if you haven't already, throw your question in the chat feature, whatever platform you're on, and hopefully we get to that question. So again, full circle here. Representative Meijer touched on some of the flaws in the current authorizations that we are currently using to legitimize our efforts overseas at this point in time. And so my question, I think best answered by Representatives Khanna and Representative Meijer are, what would a better authorization look like if we were to repeal the 2002 and the 2001 authorization for use of military force? What would a good authorization, a responsible authorization look like from the Congress?
Ro, do you want to? I'm happy to jump on that.
Sure, Bonnie, you go, and then I can go
Okay.
as well.
I mean, I think we start to look at what was wrong with the 2001 AOMF, right? No time horizon, and in this Al Qaeda and associated forces kind of carve out that was, I mean, again, I think several have mentioned, used to go after groups that didn't exist on 9/11, went after groups that were actively fighting Al Qaeda. The nexus could be so tangential that it could really apply to just about anywhere with enough of a stretch of the imagination. So the idea of making sure that any future AOMFs, number one, have a time bound, right? I think that period of review, that period of revision is essential. Number two, be very concretely tailored. And number three, have that sense of a geographic bound as well. Now, we have to recognize that some threats are going to be transnational. So it may be in and around, but make sure that that's clearly constrained. But and what that means, I think, in the short term is you chunk out what we're dealing with right now. Where are the areas where, again, we don't want to impede something that may be urgent in the short term, but make sure that everything rolls off after a certain point, so you begin to consolidate down with an eye towards just making sure nothing will be expansionary. Right. I think to me that is the most realistic short-term goal, but I'd love to open up to Ro as well and just kind of see where your thoughts are.
Thank you. Representative Khanna?
I think all those principles seem correct to me. I don't think we need another authorization into Afghanistan, so I just don't think that we need to have anything in terms of authorizing force there. And then I would, like I said, I was sympathetic to the fight of ISIS not having territory. In my view, that fight was largely won by 2018, and we should have started withdrawing our forces then. But if there was something very narrow, tailored to ISIS with a end date of authorization, as a compromise, I would be open to something that was very narrowly defined. Or if, as Dr. Ruger put it, if there's something very narrowly defined territorial about a place where we really are targeting capability of terrorists, that there's actionable intelligence are threatening us, and that there is strict restrictions to what type of activity we may be having, we can look at that kind of compromise. But I think what was said is if it's limited geographically, if it's limited by time, then you can get a Congress to compromise on things where you say, okay, it's 2 years, and even if there's some places they may be overbroad, there's still accountability. So I think you can get a compromise along those lines. But I'd be curious with Heather or Dr. Ruger as well, or Nate, what you think.
I'll just pile on with sorts of limits that Representative Meijer and Representative Khanna are recommending for any new AUMF. The main thing is we need to learn the lessons of these AUMFs that we've had, since 2001 and 2002. And, to have clarity is really, really important. People might not realize the term associated forces is not actually in the 2001 AUMF. The executive branch has claimed that Congress over time has acquiesced to the inclusion of this term in the AUMF, and they have used that to justify using force in 41 operations in 19 countries. And so really, real clarity about who, force is authorized against by naming the groups. If we want to authorize force against a country, name that country and be very clear that this means this group or this country and nothing else, and that the administration needs to come to Congress if they want to get approval, if they want to be able to use force against any other group or any other country. And also, we've seen force used against ISIS that was claimed to be a successor entity to Al-Qaeda, not even an associated force, because, as Representative Meijer alluded to, ISIS was fighting Al-Qaeda at the time. So, we really need to have these sorts of, protections in place. I seem to be seeing, growing bipartisan support for the concept of having a sunset in an AUMF, that this is really a constitutional issue. It is not a partisan issue. So, we're certainly very hopeful that this is something that is in the interest of all members of Congress, not one party or another. This is a constitutional issue, and not a partisan issue.
Thank you. I want to take an opportunity to pivot to just a couple of questions from our audience who've been watching us. I think the first one for Ms. Brennan Smith, going back to your experience as an advocate and an opinion leader, the question from Troy is, how can we better inform the citizenry on the dangers of endless wars? We need to make sure we don't repeat this mistake again. So how do we inform the citizenry on the shortfalls, the pitfalls?
Yeah, no, that is a great question. I think that a big part of the problem with these wars over the last 20 years has been a real severe lack of transparency about what the US has actually been doing. Actually, that's another element. Thank you for that great question. You've reminded me that there should also be strong transparency and reporting requirements in any new AUMF to keep Congress informed and also to keep the public informed of what is going on. Because, the Afghanistan war has been referred to as the forgotten war sometimes, because we don't always hear about what's actually going on there. So to require the administration to disclose this information to the public, what operations are being conducted, how much are they costing, how many US troops are being killed, how many civilians are being killed, to actually require the disclosure of this information in a public way. And then the public can, make their assessment about, whether they consider these wars should continue, and Congress can also be in the position of determining whether to, reauthorize an AUMF if a sunset date is coming, that sort of thing. So that would certainly facilitate that level of engagement that has been missing.
Thank you. Next question here. I think this is perhaps best answered by Representative Meijer. Sam asks, how does America's perpetual state of war harm our society? And he goes on by saying, it seems our nation has lost the connection to our military. You mentioned the civil military relationship, the importance of that.
Yeah, I think it actually gets at something even more general and more corrosive than just the dysfunctional civil military relationship we have right now, where it goes from, reverence for the troops, but a shallow reverence, to, easily politicizing or kind of trashing the men and women of our armed forces as, might befit your political agenda. But there's this underlying kind of corrosion at just the fact that we're so disconnected from our reality. We're disconnected from the consequences of the legislative action. It's the decisions that are made in DC, who people send to Congress. Folks live and die, not just within our own military, but in plenty of places overseas because of that. When I was in Afghanistan, I had staff members during the 2014 midterm elections who were asking me about individual counties in Kentucky and how they were going to go, because they thought the balance of the Senate might influence whether or not, troops stayed in their country for a certain amount of time. And I realized that those midterm elections probably had a greater impact on their lives in a demonstrable way than it did on mine. And that's something I feel like we just do not understand. We don't see the consequences of the decisions we make, so we're not forced to reckon with and take responsibility for them. And until we can kind of collapse down the difference between consequence and responsibility, I just think it eats at something at the soul of our country.
Sounds like a good topic for another conversation, actually, down the road. Perhaps we'll revisit
plenty of good
that.
veteran writers to introduce and bring in that one.
Absolutely. Thank you, Representative. Let me go to Dr. Ruger, and then I think I have a good question also for Representative Khanna after that. Dr. Ruger, Mark asks, what steps should America take to ensure that we can disengage from Afghanistan while safeguarding our national interests?
Yeah, again, I think we have to overcome the mythology of the safe haven, right? For one, terrorist organizations can utilize all kinds of different spaces in order to plan or facilitate attacks. I mean, if you think about even attacks like 9/11, you had people doing flight training in Florida. You had people in Europe. It's not as if you need what I think is in people's heads of this, barren desert where there's an enemy encampment and they're planning these things. I mean, terrorist organizations have operated in dense urban areas, in countrysides, in mountains throughout history. And so, Al-Qaeda or any other group that has the intent and capability to harm the United States doesn't need Afghanistan in order to do these things. And that's why we have to have global intelligence capability that can help keep us safe. And we need to have the willpower to do that. And 9/11 in some ways was a challenge of will, right? We knew that Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden and Zawahiri, right, that these were people that were, that had hostile intent. But again, with the aspect of force of hindsight that we have now, I think we will have the will to do that globally. And there are ways to do that in a fashion that's legal, that keeps Congress in the loop, and so forth. So I don't think that we need to be in Afghanistan for that reason. And I also say that, look, even if the Taliban came back into power in Afghanistan, the Taliban has an interest in making sure that they are not punished for 2 decades like we've punished them on the battlefield. And that's why I think a lot of our veterans should be proud of what we did accomplish in Afghanistan. We punished the Taliban. We attrited Al-Qaeda. Those are important things. And the Taliban will have an interest in making sure that they don't have to suffer that fate again. And again, even while they have operational momentum on the battlefield, and the New York Times was reporting about this today, and I recommend reading that, the fact is they did suffer a great deal in these conflicts. And I think that they would rather not be an international pariah. And I think they would rather make sure that they can continue to do what they want to do, which again, I would disagree about the kind of what type of Afghan society should look like. But again, the United States shouldn't dictate how every country in the world operates. And I think we have to realize that. And to build sustainable long-term change in places like that, NGOs are better suited. Education, diplomacy. We need to convince people about the virtues of liberalism, especially by our example. And hopefully they will take that guidance, but I'm not sure that we need to be there to do that.
Thank you. I just got a note. I think Representative Khanna is coming up on a hard stop. Representative, I just want to give you an opportunity. Any closing thoughts on your views on this issue or work that you're doing?
I really enjoyed and learned from this panel, and Heather, and thank you, and Dr. Ruger and Representative Meijer. First time I've heard you speak, but very, very thoughtful. I look forward to working together. Your remarks about Afghanistan reminded me of someone I met overseas once who said, I don't think people in Iowa, the few 100,000, realize how much impact they have on the entire world. And sometimes I think we don't recognize the extraordinary responsibility and influence we have on the world, where the smallest decisions we may make impact literally hundreds of thousands of lives. To me, I think when I think of our promise, I think of two things. I think we're going to become the first major multiracial democracy in the history of the world. And that's an extraordinary achievement when we do something that I don't think any other great power has done or any major democracy has done. And then I believe we'll be largely a major power that has eschewed the colonial aspirations of a Britain or a Rome or other great powers. And to me, those should be the defining values of when we think of America's exceptional contribution to history that we should be proud of. And what we should be focused on is how we win and outcompete the Chinese model, not by replicating a Cold War, but by making sure that a multiracial democracy that believes in free enterprise is going to lead in technology, lead in innovation, lead in wealth generation, lead in being an attractive place for people to live. And I think that these kind of forays that we've undertaken have distract from those core principles, which is our historical mission. So it is more than just the loss of life. It's more than just the loss of treasure. It's actions that aren't consistent with what I would argue are our highest ideals as Americans.
Representative, thank you so much. If you have to drop, we understand, but we really appreciate you joining us and spending your time with us.
I really enjoyed it. I look forward to doing it again. I think they said I have some other caucus called for the Bay Area, so I got to always put the constituents first, but I've really appreciated this.
Thank you. And speaking of timelines, Representative Meijer, I'll let you offer any last words you have. I think you have a hard stop.
I'll wait to hear him, so I can.
No, I mean, I do just think we're at a very positive moment. I mean, we have the ability to look back and reflect on what's transpired in the 20 years since 9/11. I mean, what are the lessons learned that have been achieved for the better, and how can we make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes that we've made in the past 2 decades as well? So I think going forward with a new sense of accountability for our war powers is essential. Making sure that we are aligning our commitment to the world with what we're actually willing to commit, I think will be important. And I'm optimistic for myself and my fellow veterans that, we'll look at this again, as Dr. Ruger was saying, with pride at what we've accomplished, but also with a sense of humility as a country to make sure that we don't put ourselves in this position and that we are, again, a force for good in the world and not one that finds itself getting mired in various conflicts that were not of our own making, but will quickly become our wars as well. So I'm grateful to this panel. I'm grateful to my colleagues across the aisle, like Representative Khanna, how we can finally be moving forward in a strong bipartisan way on things that are not really partisan, but just frankly good policy.
It's encouraging, and thank you both for your leadership, Representative Khanna and Representative Meijer, and thanks for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Nate.
Thank you very much. Heather Brandon Smith, go to you next. Last words from you.
Oh, sure. So I guess I will. I wanted to thank Representative Khanna, in absentia, for his work that he's done to reassert congressional war powers, and also to thank Representative Meijer for really getting off to such an incredible start on this. I did see you at the markup of the bill to repeal the 2002 AUMF last week. Really appreciate your strong statements in support of that and just the work that you're doing. And of course, to thank Dr. Ruger for your years and years of work along, on the outside, as I am as well. And so, I likewise am hopeful that, we're finally going to start getting somewhere. I think the first step is to repeal this 2002 Iraq AUMF. You know, it's not being used for any current operations, but it's open to abuse. It has been abused. It was claimed as authority for the Soleimani strike, along with the president's Article 2 powers. So, you know, I'd love to see Congress get that off the books and then, you know, sort of galvanize support from that and really start to tackle these bigger war powers and AUMF issues.
Thank you. We may be closer than some think. We will see, and I think you'll certainly be working toward it. So thank you for your time and for sharing your thoughts tonight. Dr. Ruger, we'll go to you next.
Yeah, I mean, Heather's such a rock star on that issue that I'm going to let her have the last word, you know, on AUMFs. But I'll just pivot, you know, to Afghanistan on the policy side and the politics. I mean, it's good politics and it's good policy for us to leave. We've talked a lot about the policy angle. Let's talk a little bit about the politics to close, which is I think that, you know, the polling that's been done, and I'd reference one, the YouGov poll that found that 70% of veterans and military households would support the president withdrawing from Afghanistan. And I think that says a lot, right? Because, you know, these are people who as Representative Meijer talked about, the small set of people that have paid the greatest cost. And look, we need to pay that cost as veterans, as military families, when it's required for our national interests. And that's why we should honor veterans when they do that. But I think they understand that we don't need to be doing this any longer. We need to safeguard our resources for other ends. We need to be focused on the most important foreign policy goals of the 21st century. And look, the Middle East is a place we have to keep our eye on, but it is a tertiary theater of interest to the United States at this point. And I think that we need to recognize that. And back to the politics, you know, when that many people support something, you know, there's a lot of bipartisanship. And that's what's exciting to me about not just this issue, but realism and restraint overall, where we see people coming together, left, right, center, non-aligned, right? Republicans, Democrats, libertarians, socialists, progressives, right? They're really thinking we need a reset of our American foreign policy. So I think there's space for a president. And if President Biden chooses to follow realism and restraint, then I think people should praise him. I mean, I know that the Stand Together community will stand behind no one in thanking the president if he withdraws from these wars that are no longer necessary, right sizes our foreign policy. And look, I'd be happy to be the first among them. But if he doesn't, then I think that's going to be very dangerous, not only for himself, but for the country. And in terms of for himself, I mean, if Afghanistan becomes Biden's war, then he's going to own that. And the longer it goes on, and if there's an extension and it's long and there's spoilers and we end up staying, the longer that goes on, the more he owns those results. And it would be terrible, because I think we have a honorable way to exit from America's longest war. President Trump set us on that course. Ambassador Khalilzad set us on that course. And we would hate to see, I think, this withdrawal with honor end because we had to adopt Biden's war. And I think President Biden doesn't want that. I think what you'd love to see is a Trump-Biden withdrawal that's bipartisan and that leads to us being able to close this chapter in terms of our military presence while staying engaged diplomatically, staying engaged in terms of financial assistance, and importantly, staying engaged in terms of NGOs and individuals engaging with Afghanistan to hopefully help Afghanistan become a better place. And if Afghanistan doesn't choose that for itself, you know, we don't have to ask, you know, people in Iowa or people in San Francisco or people in Michigan to have to continue to fight those endless wars. And so I would conclude with the fact that, look, it's good policy and it's good politics. So I hope we'll see an end to this and we can all, I think, you know, kind of turn our attention elsewhere.
Well, I know all of you here will be watching closely to see what happens in the coming weeks. Concerned Veterans for America certainly will. It's a very important issue and a pivotal moment in that important issue. So we will be watching closely. Thank you so much to my guests who took time out of your evening to join us. Thanks also to our online audience. We really hope this was valuable for you. And if the discussion got you thinking about the issue, I want to invite you to check out our special project called End Endless Wars. Just go to endendlesswars.com and find out more about it. We'd love to see you also engage with us on social media. We're on Twitter at Concerned Vets and Facebook, Concerned Vets for America. And of course, our website, cv4a.org. Please check us out. And on behalf of the whole CVA team, we will see you next time. Thank you very much, everybody.